Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today I'll be speaking with Matt Verlinich. Matt was the founding general manager of TechShop Pittsburgh and a founding member of the Protohaven Makerspace. He's also the founder of Clear Ice Rocks, where he invented, prototyped, crowdfunded, and mass-produced a system for creating completely clear ice at home. Matt is now a part of the Innovation Works team, where he helps guide early-stage hardware companies through the design and manufacturing process. We discuss his insights into the maker movement and where it's headed, the relationship between makers and entrepreneurs, how you can work to get a product made and marketed, life logging, and more. This episode is brought to you by the Smart Manufacturing Experience, taking place June 2nd through 4th, 2020 in Pittsburgh. This event provides solutions for applying the latest smart manufacturing technologies that drive results. Share your smart technologies to an audience eager for the latest innovations and know-how in Industry 4.0. Smart Manufacturing Experience focus areas are artificial intelligence, augmented and virtual reality, cybersecurity, additive manufacturing and 3D printing, automation and robotics, data analytics, industrial IoT, and workforce transformation. Be part of the experience to connect face-to-face with qualified decision makers searching for these disruptive technologies. Visit bit.ly/SMX20 to learn more about becoming an experience partner. That's bit.ly/SMX20 to learn more about becoming an experience partner. As always, show notes and links are available at futuregrind.org. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure to subscribe on all of these platforms, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support, or you can purchase some of our newly released products at futuregrind.org/store. Because of you, this is Future Grind. All right, and now we are here with Matt. Matt, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So this is definitely going to be a wide-ranging conversation. You have a lot going on and a lot to talk about, but I think it would make the most sense to start this with a topic that seems to be the genesis of your involvement with entrepreneurship and manufacturing and the maker community in general, and that is TechShop. So broadly, what is or was TechShop, and what was your involvement with them?
So TechShop was a makerspace, or rather a brand of makerspaces. It was actually one of the first makerspaces to have multiple locations in different cities. That was their mission, was to spread this same type of workshop. And for those who don't know, a makerspace is essentially a big shared space that has a collection of tools in it for the purpose of making things. TechShop kind of became a de facto standard for makerspaces in that it had set out a list of equipment which would allow members of the space to make pretty much anything that they could dream of, and that was the slogan: "Build your dreams here." So it had, laser cutters and 3D printers, which have commonly been associated with fab labs or hacker spaces or similar types of spaces. But in addition to that, it also had machine shop, welding, full wood shop, sheet metal fab, electronics, textiles, hand tools, computer design clusters, meeting spaces, etc. I was hired on as the general manager of the Pittsburgh location. So TechShop's priority was expansion. They had some successful stores in the Bay Area, and they wanted to replicate that success in as many different markets as possible. But they did so with a very lean staff, and so they would always go into a new market and hire somebody from that area. So when I heard TechShop, I'd been following TechShop through the maker community, and Instructables actually was where I'd first heard about TechShop. When I heard that they were coming to Pittsburgh, I jumped on the opportunity to take some part in it. And they actually selected me for the general manager role, which in practice and in technicality, I own the P&L for that location, which basically set me up as kind of a business manager or like an office manager. But in practicality, I was the business owner. I had essentially the full responsibility for hiring, training, bringing on, developing business plans, forecasting the business, everything.
And who were the people that came to TechShop? Were they hobbyists or artists or students? Who were they and why did they come?
That's a great question. I would say the common thread of what drew people into TechShop was the slogan, "Build your dreams here." So everybody that came to TechShop was somebody who had a dream or a vision of something that they wanted to make or something that they wanted to learn how to make. And in my head, I kind of broke them down into roughly three different categories. There were the hobbyists, which was by and large the majority of the people who came into TechShop. They were the people who just were doing it for fun, just something to kill time, to have a sense of community, to learn or feel engaged in something that was transformative for them. Then there was the artists or the artisans, and those were people who were trying to use the space as a business. And the third category was the entrepreneurs who were also trying to use the space for their business. The difference between the artisans and the entrepreneurs, though, in my mind, was that the artisans loved the act of making physical things. And so they typically produced products that they sold, and that was the majority of the revenue for their business was something that they were able to produce with their own hands in the space itself. The entrepreneurs, however, were trying to build a business, and they were using the space more for prototyping or early stage production before they would eventually scale it into something that could grow into a larger enterprise. And so the motivation was that the entrepreneurs typically had a bigger dream of building a business structure more so than just building the actual physical products.
And did these categories determine how they used the space and how long they stuck around? For example, I imagine that the people who wanted to scale a business only needed membership for a few months while they were prototyping, and the artisans might only need it when they are creating more inventory. Did you notice anything like this? How did membership change and fluctuate?
That is another great question. I actually did pull some data on that while I was there, and overall, the average membership at TechShop was about 4 months. So we had a lot of turnover. And anecdotally, from just talking to our members, generally the entrepreneurs and the artisans had the perception that they were getting a steal because TechShop was 17,000 square feet, and they used it primarily during the daytime when nobody else was really around. And so they had a free run of this space for $125 a month. And they could host meetings there, and they could run themselves like a professional business. They had shipping and receiving there. They had a front desk. They could receive mail. So it was a really great steal, being cheaper than most co-working spaces. But then for the hobbyists, it was also $125 a month. And it was in general viewed as a luxury expense, which attracted only very well-off individuals who would be willing to tolerate that on an ongoing month-to-month basis. And that's where we would see a lot of turnover, especially there, as people would come. They would come and go when they had a project or when they had an interest or when they had free time.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. When you consider the cost of a co-working space and the fact that you had additional benefits as well, it's almost like the access to tools were just an added bonus. And that would be a huge bonus because I imagine that much of the equipment at TechShop costs thousands or in some cases tens of thousands of dollars. What was the most expensive piece of equipment you had? And how did those financials work?
Yeah, the most expensive piece of equipment that we had standard at I think every tech shop eventually. In the early days before the equipment list was fully standard, there was some variations, but the water jet became a staple piece of equipment at every tech shop, and that was between 250 and $500,000, but that piece of equipment was actually leased in most cases. So yeah, that is definitely the most expensive piece of equipment. In terms of how that was financed, most of the time, TechShop. So TechShop attracted, I think, over its entire lifespan, about $80 million in investment. And that came from the federal government, local governments, corporations, private individuals, fundraisers. It really came from a variety of different sources, but they were triggered largely by shop openings. So when TechShop opened in a new city, they looked for partners who would be willing to invest $3 to $5 million to get the shop up and running. And that was both for equipment financing, but also for operational costs to float the shop while it built the community, which was so essential to actually developing a thriving business.
So, TechShop was a for-profit corporation, but I can see why cities and local governments and economic development organizations would want something like TechShop in the area to build up that maker community and provide, as you mentioned, a co-working type space for businesses to thrive and people to make. Did you see a lot of those partnerships with local government and organizations?
Yeah, we saw it varied from location to location. In Detroit, it was Ford. Ford put it on their campus, and it was for the community, which I thought was a very forward-thinking, awesome initiative, but it was also for their employees to create an open innovation climate amongst the corporation, as well as to just be a benefit of employment there. But then there was a university partnership in Arizona. In Pittsburgh, it was largely actually a common misconception. It was actually largely a real estate play with Walnut Capital. They were looking for a tenant who would be able to go into Bakery Square that would kind of create a different, innovative type of atmosphere there. And that was also a number of other locations too, were actually commercial real estate developers who were looking for some kind of anchor tenant that would attract a creative class to come to their location.
Well, if that was Walnut Capital's intention, I think it worked out pretty well. I'm not sure how much of this is directly related to TechShop, but when I think of Bakery Square and the things in the area there, including Google, Pitt's Human Engineering Research Lab, UPMC Enterprises, and the Ascender co-working space, I definitely think of innovation. And you began your journey to entrepreneurship around this time as well. And you were creating a physical product that required prototyping and design. Were you always interested in entrepreneurship and creating physical products, and that's why you worked at TechShop? Or were you inspired and motivated by the community at TechShop to do this? I understand that's kind of a binary option and it was likely a lot less clear, but I'm interested to know if you have a sense of what might have come first.
Yeah, I do have a pretty good idea of how my journey progressed. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I'm half Serbian. I grew up in Pittsburgh. My dad worked in the steel mills, and our hero growing up was Nikola Tesla. So he was a Serbian American.
That's a good hero to have.
Yeah, and so that was always my dream, was to be an inventor. But as I kind of grew up, I realized, okay, I need to go to college. I need to learn. I went to college. I did research there. My research was fabricating novel biodiesel reactors for a startup company. So I kind of got a look into entrepreneurship in college, but I didn't really feel prepared to set out on that journey. And also, I had to put myself through college, paying all my own loans and whatnot. So I decided to get a job working for a big corporation, Westinghouse, to save up some money, learn, pay off my loans, that kind of stuff. And the reason why I joined TechShop was because I wanted to get back closer to an entrepreneurial community, but still wasn't quite ready. Didn't feel like I had the skills and the knowledge to start out on my own. So it was the perfect opportunity for me to continue learning sort of on the job. And I can't express how much I was able to learn and glean from my experience working at TechShop. So when my time there came to an end, and I felt that there was nothing I could do any longer to help that business, I decided to go out on my own. And that was the first time in my life that I really finally felt ready to try to do something on my own. And I knew that being an entrepreneur really requires having a good team around you in most cases, especially the more complicated the idea. And at that time, I didn't really have any partners or people that I was ready to go into business with. So I actually turned and filtered my many, many, many ideas that I had in a notebook down to ones that I felt like I had a reasonable chance of making sustainable on my own. And that was one of the filters that got me to clear ice rocks.
I'm going to want to come back to the closure of TechShop and what happened with that in terms of the maker community in Pittsburgh, but we've already teased your product a bit, so let's dive into that a bit more. What is your company? What do you make? And why did you start it?
Yeah, so the company is Clear Ice Rocks, and it is an ice mold system that allows you to cast perfectly clear ice cubes in your freezer at home. The reason why I started it personally is it's funny, it's a classic entrepreneurial mistake is that inventors want to make products for themselves and not for a market. And my desire with it was just because I was always fascinated with icicles and ice sculptures and these natural ice formations that look like glass and were so perfectly clear that it's a conversation starter to me and it's a thing of wonder. And I just ask myself, okay, if every liquor company, every beverage company in the world advertises their product on a perfectly clear ice cube, there's this universal appeal of that aesthetic. Why can't I put an ice cube mold in my freezer and have it come out perfectly clear? It always looks warped and cracked and cloudy and, to be honest, to me, like garbage. So that was my problem that I set out to try to solve. And so I started prototyping, actually working at tech, first while I was general manager at TechShop, and then I became just an instructor teaching classes and freelancing out of TechShop. So I started prototyping, found a way to do it, and decided that that was the idea that I was going to try to pursue. So I threw up a crowdfunding campaign just to see if I could actually sell enough units to actually make it sustainable. But in reality, what it turned out to be is that the reason why it was successful was because there's a very strong niche market around home bartenders, cocktail enthusiasts, and high-end liquor enthusiasts who really appreciate clear ice. And it hasn't quite made its way into the mass market yet, but that doesn't mean that it's not an idea that can be totally sustainable.
And I think this is kind of a good case study for people forming physical product companies, particularly ones that emerge out of makerspaces and the maker community. So I'd love to follow the process of your development here. And at that point, before the crowdfunding campaign, before all of that, you had an idea, but you didn't have much else. And this is a position that many potential makers or entrepreneurs find themselves in. So what was your next step? How did you take this from idea to reality?
Yeah, it's a good question. I started with this thesis, this idea that okay, I need to pour water into a container and put it in the freezer and have it come out perfectly clear. Can I do that? So I prototyped some different designs and found one that would work. And then I went about simplifying the design so that I could produce it myself. And that gave me the maximum flexibility of being somewhere in between a craft business or an artisan business and a full scale entrepreneurial venture or scalable business. And the reason that came about was because a friend of mine and actually an Innovation Works portfolio company, Rapid TPC, Mark, came to me and was like, don't ask yourself how much money you need to make this into a big venture. Ask yourself how little money you need in order to take the first step. And so there's three components to mine. One was designed to be an expanded foam mold. The other one was an injection mold. And then the third one was either liquid silicone rubber injection mold or a compression molded part. So they're all very simple cast parts. You pay for tooling and then you have a per piece price based on volume. It's very easy to kind of understand. And that was one of the reasons that attracted me to this venture. But each component, except for the silicone parts, I could make myself. So that became my initial goal, was 25K would be enough for me to make the silicone parts. And then for that given sales volume, I would still be able to produce in a reasonable time frame the plastic water vessels and then the foam housing. But then if I hit 50K, I would have been able to produce 2 out of the 3. If I hit 75K, I could contract manufacture all 3 of the components. So that was my thought process in selecting this particular idea and how to scale it in a way that was a very kind of lean startup approach of validating the concepts one at a time and moving forward.
So as you mentioned, there were multiple components that needed to be crafted here. The foam molds, the trays that make the ice, and the plastic holder for the trays. So if you were going to scale this at some degree, you mentioned you can't do the silicone part yourself, but you could perhaps do the rest. But you did end up having to find manufacturers. And this is another extremely daunting part of the process for entrepreneurs. And there are so many options and so many terrifying stories of people placing a huge order and receiving a defective product, or having their idea stolen in some cases, or having some other business-ending disaster. How did you navigate this, and what was your manufacturing strategy?
Absolutely. So my initial strategy was to try to make things as locally as possible. And so I reached out to a lot of US based manufacturers, and I didn't have a lot of luck with it, to be perfectly honest. It was expensive, they're slow to respond, it was tough to get the time of day. There's a lot of market and industry forces at play when trying to get something manufactured. One of them, for instance, is there's not a whole lot of, if any, manufacturers that produce silicone in the US for the consumer market. And the reason is just because in the consumer market, the margins are very low and silicone is a very expensive material. So you don't have a lot of margins to make any money off of it. And it's just nearly impossible to compete with overseas manufacturing. Since then, I've learned, and I continue to learn, many tips and tricks about how to identify good strategic partners in terms of manufacturers and which methods of manufacture might be more cost effective to make here, there, or anywhere. But it is interesting because that is actually now my job at InnovationWorks, is to try to help companies navigate those nuances based on their very specific products.
Yeah, let's get into that a bit more. So in addition to running your company, you do help other entrepreneurs and businesses grow through the work you do at InnovationWorks, specifically with their hardware program, AlphaLab Gear. So what is InnovationWorks, and what do you do there?
Yeah, so InnovationWorks is the Ben Franklin technology partner for Southwestern Pennsylvania. We've been around for over 20 years, and they started out by just investing in seed stage companies. So that's a company that already has revenue, already has a MVP, a minimum viable product, and they're looking to try to scale their business, but they're not quite ready for a very serious venture round. And they're in this gray area in between where they need some capital to grow. And that's where InnovationWorks existed for 10 plus years before the opening of AlphaLab. And AlphaLab was one of the first accelerator programs in the world. And what makes that unique is that they developed a curriculum which would help coach people and allow them to go from idea stage to the seed stage. So starting to work with entrepreneurs who are even earlier, and there's not a lot of options in the private sector for getting capital to try to help those types of entrepreneurs. But InnovationWorks, being a nonprofit that is supported by the state of Pennsylvania with the mission of economic development, has the luxury of not being constrained to always have to pick the winners. And we can take these riskier bets to work with very, very early stage companies. So then about 5 years after AlphaLab opened, most of the companies that went through AlphaLab were all software products because you'd get a small investment and then the program to get your idea off the ground. And so for a small investment, it is a lot easier to get a software product to a significant stage to attract additional funding. But 5 years go by and the maker movement is starting to really take hold, and there's a lot of options out there for cheap prototyping and production in low volumes. So the maker movement is very entwined with it. And actually, AlphaLab Gear opened, I think, a couple months after I was hired at TechShop. So when I was at TechShop, I was working with AlphaLab Gear from its very earliest stages, because the thesis is that now with these very affordable resources for prototyping, you could take physical product companies through this early MVP stage to get to a point where they can hopefully prove out their concept and attract more funding. So that was the interplay between AlphaLab, AlphaLab Gear, and InnovationWorks. And my role at InnovationWorks is to basically take everything that I'd learned from trying to produce my product here and also running TechShop and helping people prototype their products and apply that to these early stage companies that we work with to help them make intelligent decisions about how to design their product and their business for scale. Hence the scalable manufacturing program is what I'm in charge of running at InnovationWorks. And it's a twofold approach. It's both helping entrepreneurs to get access to the information and the resources they need to make their product, but also helping manufacturers to be more competitive and able and willing to work with startups.
So can you give us some examples of interesting companies that are perhaps currently in AlphaLab Gear or currently in the InnovationWorks portfolio, or those that have previously been, to give us an idea of the types of companies that go through this process?
Oh, there's so many. So I mentioned Rapid TPC earlier because they were in the very first class of AlphaLab Gear, and they started out thinking that they could make a machine. TPC stands for thermoplastic composite. So they thought that they could make machines that would allow product development houses or manufacturers to rapidly make composite parts that would compete with injection molded parts. It turns out that making the machine and the business model associated with selling machines is very different than more of a service-based business. And it turns out that they've kind of become a manufacturer themselves. And they've built up a lot of expertise around this particular style of composites. And so they actually produce parts, which is pretty freaking cool in my opinion. But then again, I'm also just a nerd about making things. So I love that. Estat Actuations is making an electroadhesive clutch, which reduces power and weight for robotic clutches by orders of magnitude. There's Aurospark, which has a wearable electronic bracelet that indicates when it's in the proximity of another bracelet. It's used for networking events. You answer a series of questions on this app, and then whenever you go into a networking event and your bracelet is in proximity of another bracelet, it will light up with different sequences to kind of indicate how much you have in common with this person, to try to spark conversation by going back through your mental list of all the questions that you answered so you can learn more about the people around you. But that's a question that we get all the time for InnovationWorks, is what type of businesses do we invest in? And InnovationWorks is industry agnostic. So we invest in consumer products, medical products, B2B companies, materials companies, software, life sciences, everything.
I can say that I went through InnovationWorks AlphaLab program with my artificial intelligence startup that I co-founded, and I have to admit that I always found an excuse to go one floor down to the AlphaLab Gear space, because I quickly found out that that's where all of the fun making and prototyping and testing was going on. It was a very different vibe down there than the people making software in their offices upstairs, and a lot more excitement. So I did enjoy going down to AlphaLab Gear and spending time down there. But you mentioned that you help these companies with manufacturing, which is
Yeah.
huge for hardware companies. So how do you handle manufacturing questions? Are there any particular things that you ask for or information that you look for?
Yeah. So it's funny actually. I love making stuff, right? And I'm an engineer and a nerd, and I love the technology behind what's going on. And most people are surprised that the first question is actually more about the business. Because at the end of the day, you can make an infinite number of choices about what methods of manufacture you'd use for your product, what materials you'd use for the product, and you could still accomplish the same goal. But the end case is that it's always going to be dictated by your business. So my first questions with people are always, what stage of the business are you in? Do you have just an idea, or do you have an early prototype that you're looking to improve on or iterate or scale? What is your target customer and their price point that you're targeting? What does your competition look like? Are you trying to come in as a premium product or a mid-market or a budget product? Because those are going to be the things that are going to dictate what volumes you need to get to, what methods of manufacture you need to get to, all of that kind of stuff.
You had mentioned earlier that when you tried to find local manufacturers for your product, you were largely unsuccessful. But how much of that was because of the type of the work that you were looking to have done? Do you find that some work is better done locally and some is better done overseas? And how do you know which is which?
Yeah, so one particular example, the silicone, as I mentioned before, it's nearly impossible to make silicone in the US unless it's medical or aerospace, medical or defense grade, because those are industries that have margins that will tolerate extremely high price points and require extremely high quality control. That's predicated on the fact that I was assuming I had to use silicone, but there are many, many, many varieties of food grade thermoplastic elastomer, or TPE, which can be run through conventional injection molding machines and produce a very similar result. So because I was speccing silicone, nobody would touch it. But if I would have shifted it to TPE and nobody told me that, I only learned about it much later, that makes it much more likely to be able to be produced here in the US, because there are many, many, many injection molders of all sizes. And a trend that I've been noticing over the last 5 or so years is that there are more and more options popping up for low volume and prototype injection molding production. That's like partially to do with 3D printing, partially to do with market forces and availability of machinery, and running smaller and smaller shops, so you can get to a shop that only has one person who's able to do it all, make the tooling, run the molder, and get you some decent number of parts for pretty cost effective, because they don't have very much overhead. So that's one particular example how and why you could shift a strategy to be able to make things locally. Another one is for electronics, is depending on the size of your boards and the components you select, it can be just as cost effective to make boards in the United States, because the same equipment, the pick and place machines that are used overseas, are used here. And if you've designed your board appropriately to fit the machines which are available locally, there's not much labor cost, which is where overseas has all the leverage. And so you can actually produce that here. But if you don't know those little subtleties based on material selection or manufacturing method selection, you can very easily just end the conversation before it begins with a domestic manufacturer.
And there are a few opportunities for people or companies to get involved with what you have going on there at InnovationWorks. What application cycles or opportunities are open now?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Right now, the application cycle is open for both the Hardware Cup and AlphaLab Gear. So if you have an idea for a physical product or an early stage prototype that you're looking to scale, you can apply at alphalabgear.org. It's one application for both programs, both the Hardware Cup and the and AlphaLab Gear. AlphaLab Gear's cohort will begin in April and run for, I think, just shy of 30 weeks next year. The Hardware Cup is an international pitch competition, which gives you an option to basically pitch in this sort of, I guess, round robin tournament where we do a pitch competition in many different cities all around the world. The winner of each city comes to Pittsburgh for the international finals, and the winner of the finals gets $50,000 investment from StartBot, one of our partners. And I believe they have the option to participate in the AlphaLab Gear cohort, but not the requirement. Whereas if you get selected for the AlphaLab Gear cohort, I think you have an option of either $25,000 or $50,000 of investment for different equity stakes, in addition to having to participate in the programming.
Yeah, and I think something that's important to note is that while this is Pittsburgh-based, opportunities are certainly not limited to those in Pittsburgh. You mentioned that the Hardware Cup is an international competition, and companies from all over can and do apply to AlphaLab and AlphaLab Gear. But why is this? What sets you apart?
That is a great question. InnovationWorks, AlphaLab Gear, AlphaLab, the company as a whole is fairly innovative, impressively so. The Ben Franklin Technology Partnership, which funds and created InnovationWorks as well as our three partner organizations in the other corners of the state, was one of the first, I think it was the first investment program from a state government to stimulate economic development. So that's a first right there. And then AlphaLab was, I think, one of the first 5 accelerator programs in the world, after names that you've probably recognized like Y Combinator. So again, very early on, gave them the ability to have a long track record and reputation of successes. Then AlphaLab Gear was also one of the first 5 physical product dedicated accelerators in the world. The Hardware Cup was one of the first international pitch competitions for hardware specific businesses. They're all very innovative concepts and we really strive to implement that lean startup continuous improvement methodology in everything that we do. So we're always trying to innovate and maintain and stay relevant with what the current market forces are and what trends are developing.
So taking this back to TechShop for a bit, of course TechShop had a very public collapse in 2017 when they closed locations and declared bankruptcy. And this was a huge blow not only to the communities that had grown up around tech shops in various cities, but also a blow to the maker community overall as well. Is this something that you saw coming, or what do you think went wrong there? And do you think it could have been avoidable?
Yes, it was definitely something that I saw coming. It was definitely something that could have been avoidable, but it's also something that's difficult. Obviously, hindsight's 2020, but the maker movement as a whole kind of followed your traditional hype curve, where it started out slow and then it kind of hockey sticked upwards. It hit a peak, and that was probably right around 2014, 2015, when President Obama had the White House Maker Fair and brought a lot of public awareness to this maker movement. And I would say that we have recently hit the bottom of that hype curve on the other side with the suspension of Maker Fair and Make Magazine, which was the organization Dale Doherty of Make Magazine coined the term maker. The very first time that was used was by that magazine. And it was in an attempt to try to bring together all of these different hobbyists and enthusiasts into one moniker so that they could share across disciplines. Whether you're a fabric artist or a machinist, these people have something in common, and it's the fact that they like to make things themselves. So it was a very powerful movement, and I think that we've hit bottom and we're coming out of it now, and we're in a really good place to try to start developing a sustainable approach to how this can benefit society moving forward. The problem with TechShop was that they really rode that growth curve pretty hard, and they prioritized expansion over all things because they were attracting a lot of investment. And as a result, we didn't do anything particularly well. We had a number of different revenue streams. We had membership, education, events, team building. We had prototyping as a service. We had retail. TechShop did it all, and as a result, didn't do anything particularly well. And that was stolidly maintained all the way up to the very end, as is evident by the fact that the Brooklyn TechShop opened 2 weeks before the entire company was completely bankrupt. Pittsburgh was in actually a pretty unique position because towards the end, when it became apparent that TechShop was in real serious financial trouble, they started to try to close locations, and Pittsburgh was the first location that they tried to close. They made an announcement, I believe, in about May of 2017, that they were going to close the Pittsburgh location in September. And then in probably August, they announced that they were going to let Pittsburgh stay open to try to establish its own stand-up location through November. They would give them like a 2-month extension. And then in November, the entire company went bankrupt. So.
And you mentioned that Pittsburgh was kind of a unique case here, because things played out differently in Pittsburgh than they did in other cities. And the Pittsburgh story, I think, had a much happier ending. So I'd love for you to tell this story. What happened to the TechShop community in Pittsburgh after it closed?
Yeah, so in accordance, I want to make sure that I'm not doing disservice to the maker community as a whole and making this too much about TechShop, because TechShop was not for the entire maker community. There are makerspaces that have existed just as long as TechShop and that are still around, like Artisan Asylum up in Somerville, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. They have existed and been stable since the very first TechShop opened. The oldest makerspace in Pittsburgh actually identifies as a hackerspace, and it's Hack Pittsburgh. A couple of my friends and former employees started the first feminist makerspace, Prototype, in Pittsburgh while TechShop was still around. Most of the libraries have developed, and a lot of our schools, both Pittsburgh Public and in the broader community, have been developing these makerspaces and mobile makerspaces. The Carnegie Science Center has one, all through that growth of that hype curve, and many of them are still around. Now, to get back to like the saga of TechShop and what makes that kind of unique is TechShop announced that they were closing and then encouraged the TechShop community, which self-identified by choosing to be members there as opposed to anywhere else, gave them the option to try to form a sustainable business of their own. And so that is where Protohaven emerged from. These meetings, which we used to have in TechShop before it closed, with trying to develop a place and a business model that would be sustainable. And what Protohaven has become is a nonprofit version of TechShop. So it started with a seed crystal of a lot of original TechShop employees and members, and they nailed down a location in Wilkinsburg, and they actually were able to get their hands on all of TechShop's old equipment. Because of the way that TechShop went bankrupt, all the equipment ended up being owned by Walnut Capital, the landlord. And then the landlord chose to sell the equipment in one lot rather than auctioning it off piecemeal to Protohaven, so that Protohaven was able to get a really solid start and fairly smooth transition of TechShop was bankrupt and closed in November. I think it was mid-November. December 1st, Protohaven opened its doors. So
I'm so glad that Protohaven was able to make that happen. And Protohaven was actually the site that hosted our Body Hacks East Human Augmentation Conference in 2018, which Future Grind sponsored. So there's some connection there as well. So I'm going to switch topics here a bit and ask you about something that I just found out about. Is it true that you've kept a photo log of what you do every day since 2004?
Yeah, it is.
I'm so impressed by this. What started this? Why do you do it, and how old were you when you got started?
So let's see. I was probably 16 or 17 years old when I started, and pictures have always been big in my family. And we would go on family vacations, and you'd get your film camera, and parents would be like, "Okay, here's your rolls of film. So take your pictures, and we'll get them developed. But you only have 48 shots with two rolls of film, and so you have to really be careful about what you're taking pictures of." Well, by the time I was 16, 17 years old, I had a job and had my own money, and I started to see digital cameras developing where it was like, oh, I can take hundreds of pictures and it will take up no space to store these, no physical space. And I don't have to print them out, but I can. I want to take these pictures because I've always been fascinated with who we are as humans and what influences kind of shape us. And a big part of that is, who your parents are and what shaped them. And my parents didn't have a lot of pictures from whenever they were younger, whenever they were my age at any given point in time. So I thought it would be cool and fairly easy to just start doing it. And I kind of never stopped. And it's only really gotten easier and easier over time, which is pretty interesting. The biggest disappointment that I'd have to say with my photo journal is I've never actually done anything with it. It's always been more of a personal kind of diary more than anything. But one of my friends and former employees and business partner, Joe Brown, who's a photographer, actually turned me on to this thing that he started doing in, I think, 2014 called 1 second a day. And he, instead of taking pictures every day, he at least makes sure that he has 1 second of video clip that represents each day. Every year, he strings those together into a snapshot of his life for that year, which I think is really cool. And so for the last couple of years, I've been trying to make sure that I do that. And I think this year is going to be the first year that I actually accomplish it. It's a lot more work than it sounds like to synthesize. It's way easier to just take and keep the pictures.
Yeah, I really like the idea of an end of the year project. And honestly, I've tried things like this before, but I always end up failing after a bit. And one of the reasons is the file management aspect. I don't want to have to take photos and worry about uploading them to the right spot and separating them from my other photos, and it all becomes a hassle. So what's your file management system, and how do you manage that?
I used to use individual folders for every day in like a big complicated file tree, which definitely does get cumbersome. I really want to start using probably Adobe Lightroom to organize them because it makes it more of a database and makes it more usable. But Google Photos is starting to get pretty good at that stuff, but data privacy and whatnot kind of makes me a little bit nervous. Most recently, because I have been a little bit short on time with two jobs, I've just been putting them into folders by month, which makes it a lot easier.
So are these selfies or photos of you, or are they just of your environment? Do you make sure to get any certain type every day or anything?
Almost never pictures of me, actually. I take pictures. I try to take mostly candid pictures of what's going on in the moment. I'll also take pictures of random things like receipts or like a playbill if I've gone out to a show or a movie ticket, something where it's like you can't really take a picture in a movie theater, but you can take a picture of the ticket and then know you did that.
I'm sorry I'm asking so many questions about this, but I could totally nerd out over things like this.
Yeah.
Do you try to focus on positive moments and interesting things, or do you capture sad and boring moments as well?
Oh, that is a great question. Very insightful question. I think that I am a bit of an oddball in that I'm really a scientist at heart. My major is actually not mechanical engineering; it's engineering science and mechanics. This hybrid discipline of science and engineering. So I take a very scientific approach with this, and I attempt to be an unbiased documentarian of my own life. So yeah, I mean, I have pictures of me crying. I have pictures of some of the worst moments of my life. And one of the really interesting things that I've kind of noticed, biologically speaking, about how this has influenced me is that for a while I thought that I had a really terrible memory as a result. Like for a while I had a great memory. Then I thought after doing this I had a terrible memory. And then I realized that my memory is now tied to the act of taking the picture. So if I see a picture, I can remember a whole host of emotions and scenarios around that picture because that is like the physical trigger that allows me to retrieve the memory in my brain. And so when you go back and look through the pictures, you would think that when you see those terrible pictures of some of the worst times of my life, that would bring an overwhelming feeling of like despair for that memory. But they're so few and far between that it actually is a much more rejuvenating experience to look back and realize how few and small they are in impact and number compared to all of the wonderful aspects of life.
Yeah, what you said about memory is very interesting. I read a study once. I'm probably going to get some of the details wrong here, but I think the outcome was essentially that the act of taking a photograph of something makes you less likely to remember the details of that thing, and they weren't sure why this happens. But I think my speculation is that your brain kind of outsources the need to remember details if it knows that there is another log of that created, and so it doesn't commit those things to memory. But I'll try to find this study and link to it in the show notes because it was a very interesting read.
Please do. I've definitely realized that, and I've tried to actually make the act of, as a result, I've tried to make the act of taking the picture be a point where I will stop and reflect
Yeah, that makes
so
sense.
that I can encode an actual memory there as opposed to just relying on the picture because I definitely did that for a long period of time.
Well, I think this is great. You've definitely inspired me, and I want to give this another try. I want to see if I can stick with it this time.
Yes, do it.
So, one last question.
hmm
What's next for you? What are your plans for the future, and are there any projects on the horizon?
So I'm in a weird position right now where there's so much synergy between my professional life and my personal life and entrepreneurial journey because I really like having an impact. I really like teaching, and that's where I've always wanted to get to. So what I think that I'm going to do is as I add products to the Clear Ice Rocks brand, I'm going to try to journal and like document that as a how-to guide to teach people about making physical products, which will be beneficial for my work in the entrepreneurial community here and hopefully digitally all over the world. And in the process, keep developing products. And one of the things that I've picked up as a result of working at Innovation Works, which I'm extremely grateful and appreciative of, is I haven't had any formal business training, only the informal stuff that I've picked up on the way. And working at Innovation Works and with all of these other different entrepreneurs of different styles of business and industry, I realized how important it is to build the business itself, the structure, the people, so that it can grow and scale. And I'm very excited to start applying that to my own business so that I can achieve more than you can on your own. It's like that proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
I love the idea of documenting your journey with Clear Ice Rocks, and I can't wait to check that out when you release something. And let me know when that happens because I think my audience would be interested as well. So I lied. One last question, and that is where are your products available now? How can someone in my audience start making their own clear ice?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So you can buy them on my website at clearice.rocks, ROCKS, or you can buy them on Amazon by looking up On the Rocks, one word, which is the product's name.
Sounds good. I will put those links in the show notes at futuregrind.org so people can go there and find the product. And Matt, thanks again for joining me on the podcast.
No problem. Thank you, Ryan. This was a blast. I appreciate it.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with Matt Verlinich. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. We also need your help to keep this podcast running. You can donate at futuregrind.org/support or make a purchase at futuregrind.org/store. Once again, we want to thank our sponsor, the Smart Manufacturing Experience, taking place June 2nd through 4th, 2020 in Pittsburgh. Thousands of manufacturers from across the country attend this event to learn benefits and implementation strategies for smart manufacturing. Be the expert they turn to for answers, innovations, and know-how in Industry 4.0. Smart Manufacturing Experience focuses on industrial IoT, artificial intelligence, automation and robotics, data analytics, additive manufacturing and 3D printing, augmented and virtual reality, cybersecurity, and workforce transformation. Be part of the experience. Visit bit.ly/SMX20 to learn more about becoming an experience partner. That's bit.ly/SMX20 to learn more about becoming an experience partner. Till next time, this is Future Grind.